to welcome you all very much to the webinar for the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, very appropriately for today's talk. Remind you that we're the Gertrude Bell Memorial. I'm Paul Collins. I'm the current chair of trustees of the Institute, so it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this talk. We will have an opportunity for questions at the end of the talk, and if you have any questions, please do type them into the Q&A button, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. I'll then take those questions and ask our speaker at the end of the talk if we have time. So let me now introduce today's speaker. I'm thrilled and delighted to welcome Alison Shan to the British Institute for the Study of Iraq to give this webinar. Alison and I have known each other for some time, so it's particularly exciting to have her here to talk about her research. But in many ways, Alison has two strands of work that weave together in very exciting and innovative ways. And that's combining theatre, both performance and directing, and academic research. Tell you a little bit about each of those. Alison is the founder and director of the multicultural UK production house and training centre, One World Actors Centre, which is based in Kuwait, where she has been resident for 35 years. And many of the alumni of that centre now work across the world, global in reach in the international entertainment business. She's produced bilingual productions, such as at the Edinburgh Festival, been nominated for awards and indeed received many awards and 5-star ratings for her work. I should mention that Alison is an advocate for the empowerment of girls. Terrific work, and now to date has worked on 2 global initiatives to empower poverty-stricken girls. And she was honoured in 2017 with the award of an MBE for services to dramatic arts in Kuwait and the Middle East. Very appropriately for today's talk, Alison has performed on stage in the roles of Gertrude Bell, Freya Stark, and most recently, Violet Dickson. And that brings us in a way to the second strand of her work, which as a researcher and lecturer on Middle Eastern history, specializing in the development of Anglo-Arab relations and female Arabists between 1850 and 1950. She's recently been awarded a master's degree in where she explored the influence of British women Arabists on Anglo-Arab relations in the Middle East between 1914 and 1945. And it's some of those strands that I'm delighted she'll be talking to us today about when she tells us about the accounts of activists and Arabists Gertrude Bell, Violet Dickson, and Freya Stark rewriting history. Alison, thank you so much indeed for talking to us this evening. We look forward to your talk very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. This is my ongoing research, and I would be very, very happy if you sent me information that would enable me to understand any further things that I should know. Tonight, I will talk about my research on women Arabists, women who literally raise their skirts, or in the case of Gertrude Bell, have 4 skirts, as reported by Violet Dickson, her host for dinner in Babylon, and stepped over the boundaries of class, geolocation, and the traditional feminine space. I use the term Arabist, not taken from the American Robert Kaplan's definition of the sand-mad Briton who went native in the desert, but from the Arabs, the series by His Excellency, the late Sheikh Nasser Sabah Al-Ahmed Al-Sabah, which premiered in the Dalat al-Islamiyya in Kuwait in 2020. He states It is an honorific term given to a man or woman, regardless of nationality or religion, who is an expert in understanding and experiencing the Arab language, the culture and traditions, and most importantly, who is sympathetic to the Arab causes. This evening, I will present in shortened term an introduction to three such Arabists, three women who devoted part of their lives to Iraq during World War I and World War II. Women who chose to become fluent in the Arabic language, both classical and colloquial, and live outside Little England, the British community. It's most fortunate that we have primary sources due to the unending, untiring efforts of archivists and biographers that enable us to access the letters, the journals, the travelogues, the diaries of such women. And we are reminded of Dr. Patil's comment, culture, context, and climate change a person's personality and identity, who becomes the author, narrator, and the protagonist of their own travelogue. Exactly 130 years ago, on the 10th of July, 1893, the British magazine Punch brought to the nation's attention the prominence of women explorers denied fellowship by the Royal Geographical Society. A lady, an explorer, a traveller in skirts, the notion's just a trifle too seraphic. Let them stay and mind the babies or hem our ragged shirts, but they mustn't, can't, and shan't be geographic. It wasn't until 1913 that the Society admitted the first women fellows, of which Gertrude Margaret Lothian Bell CBE was one. That year, Gertrude would receive the Gill Memorial Medal, and in 1918, the prestigious Founders Medal for her important explorations and travels in Asia Minor, Syria, Arabia, and the Euphrates. In 2017, the Gertrude Bell archives of Newcastle University were inscribed into the UNESCO International Memory of the World Register as a lasting legacy of historical record. Outstanding research has been undertaken by experts all around the globe, and TV series, films, books, plays abound. However, with so much information, I could not decide whether Gertrude Bell was an imperialist or not. She was born in 1868 into a world of international empire building, in which Britain was a forerunner. Could she not have devoted her life to the expansion of the empire? In the summer of 2020, I received two pieces of information. One was from the Cambridge Churchill archive. The second from Hamid al-Janai in Kuwait, English and Arabic. The first is a secret letter written by Hugh Fruin in 1921 to Winston Churchill, now accessible to the public. Hugh had attended the coronation of King Faisal I in Baghdad that summer and thought it was imperative that Churchill knew his thoughts on Gertrude Bell, British advisor to King Faisal. It reads, Gertrude Bell is Maiden, mother of the faithful, which gives you some idea of the extent of the prestige. She is credited with being pan-Arab and desires Arab hegemony to embrace Iraq, Hijaz, Syria, and Palestine in a single kingdom. The widespread belief in this is the secret of her immense success and her influence. She is the most remarkable woman, combining a woman's impulses with a man's habit of thought and action. I class her with Lawrence as a potential danger that requires constant watching. From Hamid al-Janai, I received a copy of the bilingual film Clash of Loyalties, produced by Iraq Theatre in 1983. The film focuses on the turbulent years of British administration from World War I to the Iraq Revolt of 1920. The protagonists, regardless of the fact that Oliver Reed is in the picture, are Oriental Secretary Gertrude Bell, strongly supporting the Iraqi people, assisted by her political agents, and the acting commissioner of Iraq, Sir Arnold Wilson, assisted by the army, representing the ideal of British expansion. The executive producer of this film was President Saddam Hussein. I wanted to discover the person, and through that, I needed to know her foundations. Contrary to popular belief, Gertrude was neither London gentry or a supporter of the Conservative Party, the Tories, but heralded from the self-made middle classes of the industrial north, Newcastle upon Tyne. Her grandfather, Sir Isaac Lothian Bell, a Victorian ironmaster and Liberal Party MP, supporting Home Rule for the Irish, which would extend to the Welsh, and class equality and human rights, received his baronetcy in 1885 for his exceptional development of the iron and steel industry. Her parents, father and long-time confidant Sir Hugh Bell, was Justice of the Peace, and her stepmother, author, playwright and social reformist Dame Florence Olive, Lady Bell, would instigate civic duty into a young Gertrude. Florence's interviews with ironworkers and the creation of her book At the Works would bring to the public and government attention that determined the horrific conditions of the ironworkers and factory workers. We are informed by Sir Max Mallowan in his tribute to Gertrude, marking the 50th anniversary of her death in 1976, that her politics tended towards Labour with a touch of liberalism. She was determined to excel both mentally and physically, and to become a person in her own right. Education was paramount. She was accepted into Queen's College London in 1883 and Lady Margaret's Hall, Oxford, in 1886. Her college friend, Janet Courtney, OBE, describes Gertrude in her book Recollected in Tranquility. A vivid, untidy, autumn-haired girl took our hearts by storm. She threw her untiring energy into every phase of college life. She swam, she rowed, played tennis, hockey, danced, spoke in debates, and told us about modern authors, most of who were her childhood friends. Yet all the time, she put in 7 hours' work and won as brilliant a first-class degree in the School of Modern History as ever has been in Oxford. Janet's brother, David Hogarth, would become an important person in Gertrude's life. A fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, David became a renowned archaeologist, keeper of the Ashmolean, the Oxford University's Museum of Art and Ethnology. And from 1909 to his death in 1927, he was president of the Royal Geographical Society from 1925. Throughout her travels in Ottoman Turkish Arabia between 1900 and 1914, he was the recipient of her information. In 1915, David would initiate Gertrude's invitation to join the Cairo branch of the British intelligence at a point in World War I when expertise over gender was considered vital to outcome. Apologies for the train. David described Gertrude as having a memoria technica, an extraordinary visual memory. Between 1888 and 1915, a span of 27 years, Gertrude travelled extensively across the world. However, it was in Tehran, on a visit to Florence's sister and her brother-in-law, Sir Frank Lascelles, in 1892, a time when she would become fluent in Farsi, that she had an epiphany. In her first published travelogue, Safarnama, the travel book, later renamed Persian Pictures, she wrote, "As the procession of people flies past you, you realize what a gulf lies between you. The East looks to itself. It asks nothing of you or your civilization." Throughout her travelogues, we witnessed that her worldview was evolving, and she was happy to share that with her readers. In her second travelogue, Syria, renamed Desert and the Sun, Travels in Syria and Palestine, published in 1907, she wrote, "I desired to write not so much a book of travel as an account of the people whom I met or who accompanied me on my way, and to show what the world was like in which they live and how it appears to them. It is better that they tell their tale, and I have strung together their words upon the thread of the road as I heard them. The stories of the shepherd and the man-at-arms, the talk that passed from lip to lip around the campfire, in the black tent of the Arab and the guest chambers of the Druze, as well as the most cautious utterings of the Syrian and Ottoman officials." Archaeology was the reason she gave for travel to the Ottoman authorities. They let her through. Often that they would give her soldiers to accompany her. Experts such as Dr. Lisa Cooper have explored her contributions extensively. And Lisa's book, In Search of Kings and Conquerors, Gertrude Bell and Archaeology in the Middle East, is a must-read in its entirety. By attending international excavations, Gertrude learnt her skills. She stated, "I was concerned mainly with archaeology, the results of which I did there were published in a series of papers in Revue Archéologique." Her only personal sponsored expedition was, as Dr. Cooper states, on the surface. I'd been Berkeley's, near Turkey, with William Ramsay, with whom she wrote the book The 1001 Churches, an extensive study of Christian and Byzantine churches. But solo travel was far from romantic. But having excelled in mountaineering in her youth, she would survive sandfly fever, pneumonia, jaundice, malaria, pleurisy, and suspected Spanish flu. Her leadership of her caravan through dangerous countryside, rivers, and deserts earned her the dedication of her Armenian Catholic headman, Fatu, who you can see in this photograph. And it earned her the respect of the local people, who awarded her the sobriquets El Carton in Messit in Syria, the lady, in reference to the formidable court ladies of the Ottoman Empire. Through her travels, Gertrude discovered that society is divided by caste, sect, and tribe into infinite numbers of groups, each one following a law of its own. A man may go about in public veiled up to the eyes or in a girdle. He will excite no remark. Why should he? Like everyone else, he is merely obeying his own law. However, she noticed that in political disturbances, Difference in ideology could and did create violence and massacre. As she wrote in Amrath to Amrath, published in 1910, in the aftermath of the Young Turks' revolt in 1908, she says, "The 5 years of journeying, which are recounted in this book, were months of suspense and even of terror. Constitutional government trembled in the balance and was likely to be outweighed by the force of disorder, fanaticism, massacre, and civil strife. The strict autocratic government of Sultan Abdul Hamid II had caused students and members of the militia to revolt between the 3rd and 24th of July 1908. And revolution spread, forcing the Sultan to install the second constitution, having cancelled the first due to a rise in proto-nationalism. The new government was called the Committee for Union and Progress, CUP. The Arab secret societies, which had gone underground in the Sultan's rule of censorship, emerged intent on adopting the 1905 the Arab National Council aspirations for the Arabs to release themselves from political subjugation that the Turkish imperialism and impoverishment had plunged them. Did Gertrude aggravate Arab nationalism? Turkish television affirms that she did. In its 2018 historical drama series, Peytah Abdelhamid, which portrays Bell as having a profound influence on the Arab uprising. In her book, Amrath to Amrath, she confirms her involvement in politics as she accepted invitations to the Syrian CUP committee meetings. Her question-led discussions with community leaders presented the opportunity to crystallize their aims and objectives. Bell's visit to Baghdad on that 5-month journey in 1909 gave an insight into the challenges encountered. Objection to Ottoman army conscription, paying taxes, and refusal to adhere to the rules other than tribal or to Sharia law, resulted in violence and disturbances around and along the Tigris. At the time of her arrival, 2 tribes had held the heavy traffic along the river for 5 days, using smuggled weapons, as she was told. From Ibn Sabah of Kuwait, she realized civilization is better served by amicable cooperation than by attempting to ignore and suppress divergence. During her time in Baghdad in 1909, she was granted an audience with the Naqib Abd al-Rahman al-Gulani, a learned gentleman and a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. A gentleman highly respected by all religious groups throughout the region, and an advisor for the CUP constitutional government. They had many discussions about Britain in Egypt. Gertrude listened to his comments. In discussions with laborers, Gertrude learned that the man-made irrigation had over the millennia resulted in growth of new cities, grain cultivation, and economic progress at the expense of the hinterland. She summarized that the hydraulic control was a prominent cause of famine, poverty, and lawlessness. She put her knowledge to use at the end of 1909 in the Royal Geographical Society's discussion, Mesopotamia, Past, Present, and Future, in which advisor to the CUP, irrigation specialist Sir William Wilcock, was the guest speaker. Whilst Bell agreed with Wilcock's plan for a new railway and irrigation network, and that it would bring peace and order to a turbulent Mesopotamia, she put forward her argument about hydraulic control and its proposal route, which would have excluded ancient Arab trade routes on which cities such as Aleppo had grown. What is evident in Gertrude's travelogues was that nothing could dissuade her from achieving her own goals, regardless of opinion of others. She refused to cancel her plans to travel through turbulent areas of Central Arabia in the winter of 1913 to 1914. This photograph is taken of Lady Anne Blunt by Gertrude Bell in 1907. Lady Anne Blunt had travelled through Central Arabia, and indeed she lived with the tribes in the Euphrates in 1877 and 1878. Lady Anne would become a mentor of Gertrude Bell. The great tribes of al-Rashid and al-Saud were in battle for territorial supremacy. Gertrude reported, at Ziziza, on the Hijaz Railway, I was stopped by the Ottoman government and had to be given information that the local military would require written assurances that neither they nor the government were responsible for my safety. At the same time, she received a telegram saying that the British government would disclaim all her works and not help her at all as she went towards An-Nafud. Ottoman British authorities could not persuade her to abandon her ideas, and she considered herself an outlaw. Her caravan was attacked en route, and in Hilla, at the stronghold of Ibn Rashid, without Ottoman permission to travel, Gertrude was held captive for 11 days. Her account, presented in her Royal Geographical Society talk, A Journey of Northern Arabia, depicts that she was not allowed liberty whilst awaiting al-Rashid's return from a raiding party, but that she was well treated and given permission to photograph the area before she left. Sir Percy disagreed, and having seen her, found her physically affected. Bell's independent travels had created a wealth of knowledge which would be invaluable to Britain in World War I. When the Ottoman Empire chose to enter World War I by attacking its old enemy Russia, it turned its back on the Anglo-Ottoman relationship, which was 300 years old. And on the 5th of November, 1914, as per the arrangement of the Triple Entente, France and Britain declared war on the empire. Gertrude, in her co-authorship of the government white paper, Review of the Civil Administration of Mesopotamia, wrote, British maritime and commercial interests in the Persian Gulf, together with the political importance of India, has thrust upon us responsibilities we could not avoid. Sultan Abdul Hamid called for jihad, a holy war against Christians supporting the Triple Entente countries, which was encouraged in German newspapers. Britain received support against the jihad from Sharif Hussein bin Ali al-Hashmi in his fight against the Sultan for the Caliphate and Arab independence. His sons, Faisal and Abdullah, would become the kings of Syria, Iraq, and Transjordan. On the 26th of January, 1916, Bell wrote, in her capacity of working in Cairo in intelligence, as invited by David Hogarth and T.E. Lawrence, a man came down from Simla to see me and spent a long day discussing how we should best cooperate in intelligence work so that the same ground should be covered by Egypt and by India. That was most profitable, and I sent my scheme to Cairo for approval, which I think I would get. Gertrude's plan for creating an information network was agreed. In March 1916, Such was her reputation for efficiency and hard work, that at the request of the Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, and his successor, Lord Chelmsford, Bell was offered a position in Basra in the India Expeditionary Force D, followed in May by a suggestion from Lawrence of Arabia, seconded by Sir Percy Cox, that Bell was better qualified than any male candidate to be appointed in the official role of corresponding officer between Cairo and Mesopotamia. Bell would rise to the position of Oriental Secretary under Sir Percy Cox. In this photograph, taken in 1916, we see Ibn Saud, Sir Percy Cox, and Gertrude Bell meeting together. One brief was to collect and report information to the circulated Arab bulletin described by Hogarth. The book, The Arab War, is a compilation of such of Bell's information that can be released. In its introduction, Sir Kinahan Cornwallis wrote, "Each bulletin was complete in itself, whether to describe a system, an individual, or a phase in tribal history. She wrote for an official purpose, but nothing could spoil the freshness or vividness of her style or terseness of her descriptions. Throughout them can be seen her breadth of knowledge and the sympathy for the people she loves so well." Bell's official documentation confirms that Britain created organic law, a hybrid of Ottoman and British laws. She documented the original aims: to keep intact the Turkish system to which the local people were accustomed, but free it from corruption and abuses, and increase efficiency. Turkish changed to Arabic, which satisfied local sentiment. In 1920, Gertrude protested to her parents that T.E. Lawrence's post-war criticisms of the British civil administration in the British press were untrue. T.E.L. again, when he says we have forced the English language on the country, it's not only a lie, but he also knows it is. Every jot and titch of official work is done in Arabic, in schools, law courts, hospitals. No other language is used. It's the first time that has happened since the fall of the Abbasids in the 13th century. The use of the Arabic language was a move towards independence. She became an advocate for the training of young, educated Arabic men, effendis, in the role of inspectors, which would reduce Anglo-centric British staff. In private letters, Gertrude would be critical of her superior, Sir Percy Cox, employing non-Arabic speakers in prominent positions, such as a Mr. Garbutt, appointed in 1920 as Civil Secretary, who put into place unpopular propaganda and informers due to cultural ignorance. Such men counteracted Gertrude's attempt to create coexistence. To that end, Gertrude published the educational The Arab of Mesopotamia for new arrivals, publishing it anonymously. Gertrude was contributing to the fall of the Ottoman Baghdad. It was mentioned by Cornwallis that on the British advance to Baghdad over terrain, she knew better than any serving British officer. She drafted maps that were instrumental in the safe passage of the imperial forces to Baghdad, which fell to the British on March the 10th, 1917. Through Gertrude's detailed information, Lawrence, working with a supply of British ammunition and funding, compasses, and Arabic desert skills, such as measuring distances in camel time, assisted the Arab Revolt. Brigadier General Sir William Clayton, Lawrence's superior, states, "I attribute much of the success of Colonel Lawrence's enterprises to the information studied, in which Miss Bell had a very large hand. Once in Baghdad, arriving 7 days after General Maude and Sir Percy Cox, plague, famine, and hydraulic control by the Ottomans of the Tigris were in place. She immediately visited the Nakib, who referred to himself as the spoil of war, yet agreed, with Gertrude's persuasion, to become head of the Council of State over Arab ministers in 1920, declining the offer of kingship on the excuse of age and religious grounds. He would finally accept the role of Prime Minister in King Faisal I's first constitutional government, at Faisal's request. In January of 1918, America's President Woodrow Wilson announced the 14-point plan to bring the war to a close. On the basis of the announcement, and having experienced hardship and bankruptcy in the Middle East, the Ottomans sued for peace at Madras on the 31st of October, 1918. It would be 2 years before the Treaty of Sevres in 1920 was signed with the Ottomans. Years of uncertainty, financial investment, and danger for the British civil administration in Iraq. At the time, Gertrude saw the dangers. I believe, learning from experience, that if we, Britain, had been wise, we should not have insisted on the destruction of the Turkish overlord. We should have set up an autonomous Arab state here, under nominal Turkish suzerainty, with British advice and help, thus preserving the Turkish cadre, which would have saved us tremendous difficulty. In November of 1918, Sir Percy Cox was posted to Iran to secure the Anglo-Persian Treaty and APOC. This is a picture of the Arab Revolt. As you can see, although there is a camel and the person riding the camel is carrying the flag, the wars are fought by people on horses, the Arab horses. When Sir Percy went to Persia, Arnold T. Wilson, Cox's deputy, became acting civil commissioner. Wilson was what Gertrude called an India man. Due to a continuation of jihad, the drive towards violent nationalism, combined with British government indecision, Wilson demanded that strict military rule was placed over Iraq, assisted by the RAF. Gertrude wrote to her father on the 29th of September, 1919, that India is a striking example of how not to do things. In turn, Wilson disagreed with Gertrude. She would send private letters to London, and he intercepted them. The fundamental assumption of Miss Bell is that an Arab state in Mesopotamia and the recognition of a local scheme of government would be practicable and popular. I believe it would be impossible to create a sovereign state by diplomatic or administrative means. Such was the Bell-Wilson animosity that Gertrude was almost removed from her position because of her insistence of the importance of discussing all developments with Arab notables. I gave one of my Arab friends here a bit of information I ought not to. He told me indiscretions were intolerable and I should never see another paper in the office. He stated, "You've done more harm here than anyone, you and Jeremiah." The announcement of the League of Nations mandates at the San Remo conference on the 25th of April 1920 placed Syria under the League of Nations mandate held by France, and Mesopotamia, now called Iraq, under the League of Nations mandate held by Britain, who also accepted the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. As Gertrude prophesied, it inflamed Arab nationalists who felt betrayed. During the peace conference, they've been asked to share their ideas and requirements for government with the US King Crane Commission in Syria and the British Mesopotamian referendums, coordinated by Gertrude, in Iraq, to no avail. On the 7th of November, 1920, Gertrude stated, "We all thought that Arab liberties were our true goal, and only here we find they are not. But we also find they are not in Syria and Palestine." It is not the case. Armed with British weapons and ammunitions, and convinced that Britain wanted imperial rule, members of the Ahad and the tribes and villages of the Euphrates revolted on the 2nd of July, 1920. Gertrude remained in Baghdad, determined to be of use. Whilst revolt was preached in the mosques, much turbulence was prevented through discussions between agitators and Arnold Wilson's teams in Baghdad and Basra, while the most violent was stopped by aerial warfare. In February 1920, the India Office instructed Gertrude to create the acclaimed Comprehensive Review of Civil Administration of Mesopotamia. This 150-page white paper was presented in Parliament and published on the 3rd of December 1920 in an act of activism. Bell achieved her aim to enlighten the British authorities and public about Iraq's history, inclusive of budget sheets, resources, events, problems, British successes, and British errors. With a determination to prepare the eventuality of a provisional government between 1920 and 21, Bell held councils of state meetings in her home, trying to bring together the members of a provisional government and elected assembly, assisted by Harry St. John Felby, but not approved by Wilson. A.T. Wilson was recalled to London, and Sir Percy, or Cockus, as Middle Eastern people called him, returned as High Commissioner. By 1921, the government had put Iraq in the hands of Winston Churchill in a bid not to burden British taxpayers any further, who paid millions of pounds. And they withdrew British forces. Churchill called the Arab Summit, a Middle Eastern conference in Cairo and Jerusalem between the 12th and 30th of March, 1921, which was attended by Cox's party, Iraq members of the government, and British advisors, including T.E. Lawrence. A notable presence was A.T. Wilson in the role of managing director of APOC. It was agreed that Faisal bin Hussein would be an ideal candidate for the position of King of Iraq. Bell's support of Faisal, although he was not Iraqi-born, was based on many factors. He, unlike the Ottoman Caliph, was a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He led the Arab Revolt and was supported by the Syrian Al-Fatah and the Iraqi Al-Haddad cells, and had been crowned King of Syria by the Arab Council in 1920. In July 1921, Faisal was accepted as king of Iraq. Sir Maximilian, present in Baghdad at the time, recalled old Iraqis, remembering that Faisal was elected to the throne by an overwhelming vote of tribes and townfolk. As a tribal chief, he was accepted into the tribal ceremony of Sunni tribesmen at Ramadi prior to the coronation in Baghdad. As an advisor to Faisal, Gertrude witnessed his refusal to sign an Anglo-Iraq treaty the day before his coronation in 1921, insisting on the amendment to reduce British influence. Gertrude confirms that just before the coronation, Faisal had insisted on self-determination, self-government, and sovereignty, and refused to accept British sovereignty. She states, "The Colonial Office has sent us red tape cable saying that Faisal, in his coronation speech, must announce that the ultimate authority in the land is the High Commissioner. Faisal refuses, and he's quite right. We are going, as you know, to drop the mandate and enter into treaty relations with Mesopotamia. Faisal says that from the first, we must recognize that he is an independent sovereign in treaty with us. Otherwise, he cannot hold his extremists." A hastily amended Iraq Anglo Treaty was created, drafted by the Nakib, and authorized by Sir Percy Cox, who then received the wrath of the British government. The coronation, organized by the newly appointed Arab government, took place in Baghdad on the 23rd of August, 1921. New Iraqi flags projected symbols of the new nation. Gertrude explains the time delay due to a lack of Iraqi army in the country to collect taxes or defend borders, fearing safety and stability. The government wanted to withdraw the British Army in 1922. But Gertrude persuaded them otherwise. She was worried specifically about the safety of the borders and the safety of the people. As an advisor to Faisal, Gertrude witnessed his refusal to sign many times. Gertrude used her position as advisor to Faisal for civic duty. Through the daily visiting of regions across Iraq, often by train, she created a punishing schedule and expected it from British women throughout Baghdad, refusing to allow a colonial attitude. Such an attitude resulted in the description of authoritism and a reputation for being strict. Although she was the secretary of the anti-suffrage movement in 1908, by 1922, Gertrude's work supporting women in Iraq included girls' education and the creation of women's hospitals. To celebrate the opening of the first civil hospital ward for impoverished women, many prominent Arabic ladies of Baghdad accepted the invitations to view and participate in cross-cultural tea parties. Gertrude assisted with the opening and running of the Baghdad Peace Library, established in Baghdad in 1920 at the suggestion of Murray. Gertrude devoted energy and time to the management committee and to the fundraising for the library until it was transferred to the Ministry of Education in 1924. In 1923, in a period of relative calm, an increased interest in archaeological excavation by prominent American universities, Sir Percy Cox retired, and was replaced by Sir Henry Dobbs as High Commissioner. Although still Oriental Secretary, Gertrude was not included in decision-making, therefore combined the passion, archaeology, and the civic duty that she was renowned for, and created an archaeological museum in Iraq. She persuaded King Faisal and his government to found the Baghdad Museum for Antiquities before international excavation could commence. She had to agree with the Nakib through hours of discussion that the law of excavations for partage was acceptable to protect both the national and the excavator in their interests, without which no excavation could take place. An agreement was requested from the reluctant Iraqi government committee chaired by the Nakib, who went through every point in Arabic in great detail for days. Max Mallowan, assistant to Sir Leonard Woolley, excavator of Ur, recalls that in partage, the rights of the Iraq Museum she defended like a tigress. Gertrude was determined to respect the German archaeologists, such as Robert Kodawi, who had made a great impression on her and allowed her to attend his digs. Her respect for his work and past membership resulted in her re-establishing relations and inviting the Germans to Babylon and to Assa to clear their excavation houses during her period of tenure. The arduous task of evaluating, cleaning, displaying, and cataloguing artifacts in Arabic and English in the brutal Iraqi summers was undertaken by Gertrude. She refused to stop working and had created plans to open the Baghdad School of Archaeology. The National Museum of Iraq credits Bell's work under the description of British author and its founder. Originally, the Baghdad Archaeology Museum was open to the public on 14th of June 1926. The museum was Bell's last act in the establishment of Iraq as an independent nation, as she died very early at the age of 57 in her home in Baghdad 4 weeks later on the 12th of July 1926. A military funeral was organized by King Ali, the regent of Iraq, the king's brother, in the king's absence. And the car carrying her coffin was draped with Iraqi and British flags and followed on foot by the dignitaries of Iraq and Britain with global tributes and obituaries. It was recounted that sheikhs traveled far and wide to attend the funeral. King Faisal designated the Gertrude Bell Room and unveiled a plaque in Arabic and English, which reads, Gertrude Bell, whose memory the Arabs will ever hold in reverence and affection, created this museum in 1923, being then the honorary director of antiquities for the Iraq. With wonderful knowledge and devotion, she assembled the most precious of objects in it, and through the heat of the summer, worked on them until the day of her death. King Faisal and the Iraq government are in gratitude of her great deeds in the country and have ordered that the principal wing shall bear her name. The second lady I'm going to talk about is Dame Violet Dickson. Dame Violet Dickson arrived in Baghdad whilst on honeymoon with her new husband, Captain H.P.R. Dixon. 4 months after the end of the 1920 Iraq Revolt, when the areas around the river Euphrates were still highly volatile. We are told about her information and her life. In her autobiography, 40 Years in Kuwait, she writes, I was born Violet Penelope Lucas Colcraft in Lincolnshire on September the 3rd, 1896. My father was an estate agent, and we would ride out inspecting the farms. I was taught to shoot, and the gentler side of my nature led me to collect wildflowers, a hobby I would later continue in the desert surroundings. After Violet's father died in 1909, her mother took her daughters to Switzerland. At the start of World War I, Violet returned alone to England and worked in Smith's, the bank, in Lincoln. In 1919, Violet asked to be transferred to the Cox & Co Bank in Marseille to practice her French. And one day, in walked Captain Howard Dixon of the 29th Lancers, Deccan Horse, Indian Army. He'd arrived by train from London to inquire if there was any mail for him, and was joining a ship which was to take him back to the Persian Gulf via India. He spent a short time talking to me over the counter and asked me my name. Well, I was naturally flattered. But when he walked out of the bank, I assumed that that was the last time that I would see him. Imagine my surprise when, a week later, I received a cable from him asking me to marry him. Oh, naturally, I hesitated, but not for long. I cabled back, yes. Violet arrived in Bombay on the 9th of December, 1920. She caught a troop ship, as it was very difficult to find passage before then, and a day later was married in the St. Thomas's Church by special license. After a few idyllic days at the Taj Mahal Hotel, she states, we embarked for Bahrain, where Harold was the political agent. And on arriving at Muscat, we received a cable from Sir Percy Cox to proceed directly to Basra and await further instructions. We picked up as much as we could in Bahrain, including our 2 dogs, but we had to leave the rest of the animals behind. They'd be sent on by train. It was New Year's Eve when we arrived at the Chatel Arab. It was so cold that I had to wear my husband's thick woolen clothes, but Harold was so happy to be back in Arabia. Harold was born in Damascus in the house of Lady Jane Digby in 1881, where her father had disallowed her to go, and where his father, John Dixon, was consul. John Dixon had welcomed Gertrude Bell on her arrival in Jerusalem in 1900. Sheikh Mujdur al-Mezrab, husband of Lady Jane Digby, provided a wet nurse from the Greater Nisa tribe, and according to Islamic law, Harold was considered a milk brother. He grew up being bicultural. In 1915, Harold had joined the political department in Basra under Sir Percy Cox, before becoming political officer of Nasiriyah. As assistant political officer, Harold had been responsible for handling challenges of tribal irrigation, crop growing, floods, ruined crops, famine, and intertribal disputes. Progressing to political officer in the interim period between the end of World War I and the introduction of the Iraqi mandate in 1920, Harold held majlis, councils, with the sheikhs in an attempt to heal disputes and disasters. His records are detailed in his book, Kuwait and Her Neighbors. I have included his other book, The Arab of the Desert. Both books are considered collector's items today. But to Violet, coming to Baghdad was very different. Gertrude Bell was not impressed. Gertrude Bell gave us a dinner party, and everyone spoke Arabic, which I couldn't understand. Gertrude Bell suddenly spoke in English, saying, What a pity brilliant young men go and marry such fools of women. I knew it was directed at me. In Baghdad, I had my first introduction to a thunderbox on the roof in midwinter, and the disappearance for 3 weeks of the man appointed to clean it. Harold's 2 dogs needed walking and chased every cat in the street. And I had one of my worst moments when I tried to wash, dry, and iron Harold's evening shirts, and the charcoal iron stuck to the starch, totally ruining the shirt, until our cook took pity. In 1921, Harold was appointed to be the British political officer of Hilla, the capital of Babylon, on the Euphrates. Due to it being a center of the revolt and still experiencing turbulence, the colonial office insisted that Violet stay in Baghdad and return home to Britain. She refused, and knowing the danger, accompanied Harold to his post. Violet would witness for the first time the humanity and the clemency that Harold was famous for. Men who Harold had worked with previously had been imprisoned. He arranged clemency and amnesty for all of them but 13. 13 were to be executed under his watch. Tension was rising, and still Violet refused to leave. She assisted Harold in coding the requests for the reprieve and hosting the many distraught female family members at the courtyard of her house every evening. On the appointed day of execution, on the 12th hour, a reprieve was received from a newly crowned King Faisal of Iraq and announced from the rooftops by Harold to the people below. It was a lonely existence for Violet, with Harold working on calming the region. And she had no assistants. She couldn't be an assistant. She couldn't speak Arabic. Nor had she any experience of being a homemaker. Her house was old and poorly maintained, with sand fleas, damp walls, no running water, no sanitation, threat of cholera, and a growing zoo of ill-behaved and escaping animals, most of them geese. Others a source of food. She says, I received a frantic message from the station master to fetch them. I'd been told by Harold that they were very tame and to just let them run in the garden while he was away. Everyone in our house seemed most reluctant, but I insisted. The old male oryx put down his head and with a bayonet of horns charged straight at me. I ran for my life into the house as the oryx crashed through the netting and right through the house. Another animal could have caused an international incident. On October the 23rd, King Faisal was due to visit Hilla on the way to the holy cities of Karbala and Najaf. I looked out of the window and saw my husband arriving with the king 2 hours early. The king immediately wanted lunch. I kept trying to hurry the cooks who were preparing the partridges that we had bagged the day before. Once served, King Faisal, a charming man who spoke French to me, turned to speak to Bertram Thomas, who was the first European to cross the desert and the Rue Barkali, the empty quarter, between 1930 and 31. And in a flash, our tame mongoose jumped onto the king's lap and grabbed the partridge from him, carrying it into the corner and snarling at anybody who was growling and growling and growling at them. The king said not a word, but left immediately after lunch. However, the king would send a gazelle, which he told her was for her zoo. The challenge of learning Arabic proved great, not only in sound production and dialect, but without the access to official courses, as supplied by educational establishments and the American mission in Bahrain for the medics, it was impossible for her to learn it. She found the book by Jean Vaness very useful indeed. It was called The Spoken Text of Mesopotamia, and it was written for soldiers. Dixon later became fluent in Kuwaiti and Desert Arabic, and she was determined to learn it. So she demonstrated this in the Kuwait television interview of 1974. In 1921, as her Arabic improved, Violet was able to accompany Harold on his trips to the villages, where she met and made many friends, including a lovely girl named Zara, who would become a firm friend and visit with her mother often. It can be argued that Violet's swift evolution occurred as a result of Gertrude Bell's cutting remarks. Gertrude would, however, be a regular guest for lunch and gave the Dixons a detailed tour of the excavations of Babylon, where the German offices contained journals, books, films, and artifacts, now covered in sand after the quick exodus during World War I. Violet became exactly what Gertrude had wished she would become, Al-Khatem, a name given to any respected Ottoman lady, any British lady, any American lady, any Western lady, and female doctors in the Gulf. Harold's aim was to attempt to teach the British government the importance of respecting Islamic custom, a stance Bell had advocated throughout her work as Oriental Secretary. His suggestion of the election of Abdullah Sana as the first Arabic governor in Hilla proved an excellent choice, as he introduced many reforms. But in 1931, Sana would become the male victim in an honor killing by a sheikh from Sana's wife's tribe, because he had not asked her family for permission to marry her. Harold criticized the naivety of the British advisors who jailed the sheikh for not understanding the cultural sensitivity. By 1922, it was clear that the security of the Kuwaiti border would not take place without border demarcation. Sir Percy Cox sent Harold, accompanied by Violet on her first official visit, to Bahrain to meet Ibn Saud. The aim was to secure a conference. And to pass on, this picture is what Violet Dickson would have worn down to visit Ibn Saud. She was very respectful of the dress code. The aim was to secure a conference date in the desert of Ukar, in which to discuss country borders. Violet, as Harold's typist, had won favour with Ibn Saud by offering to translate into French the daily English news bulletins received by Harold and sent them by fast camel, where they were translated from Arabic by the Foreign Secretary. Harold's account of the talks were recorded in his book Kuwait and Her Neighbours. In summary, Sir Percy Cox chaired the conferences with Sana Beg of Iraq, Ibn Saud of Najd, and Kuwait representative, the British political agent Major Moore. Harold was an observer, and he disagreed in his autobiography with Sir Percy's preferred choice of a boundary created by division by Wales, and backed Ibn Saud's suggestion of division by tribe, which had worked for Harold in his role as political officer on the Euphrates. The Najdi tribes of Ibn Saud had a problem. The Ikhwan leader, Faisal al-Darwish, was camped up to the Kuwaiti Great Wall, which, if division by tribe had occurred, would have meant that Kuwait was only in a geolocation inside its wall. So Percy drew a red line on the map after days and days of arguments. Kuwait lost 2/3 of what it believed to be its right to land and shared 2 neutral zones, which would possibly yield oil. What is most important in this account is that Gertrude Bell did not participate in the discussions. She was not in attendance, which confirms that her accounts of drawing lines in the sand, literally with the advice of Arab notables, was merely a provisional plan, one that has been attributed to her for 100 years. Turbulence was increasing, and the danger to lone political agents was the reason that they were all being removed from their posts. In 1922, incredibly sad to leave her Arab and European friends, Violet awaited the arrival of her friend Zara from the village, who visited her often. The last time I saw Zara was a few days before we left Hilla. She'd come to say goodbye. She promised to take the 2 gazelles off our hands before we left, but on the day before the departure, there was no sign of her. The following day, we received news that she'd eloped with a man she loved, refusing to marry her first cousin, who had the right to her. Her brother had followed and had killed her. It was in memory of her dear friend that Violet named her daughter, the author Zara Frith, born in India in 1925, after her. Her son, Hammer York Warrington Saud, was born in Switzerland in 1923 and was named after his father's friend, Ibn Saud, at His Highness' request. In 1929, Harold's visit to Kuwait and his desire to return to the Middle East was granted, and he was appointed political agent to Kuwait. Dame Violet's life in Kuwait lasted 61 years. It included equine raids, the discovery of oil, creating famine relief, and living in the desert for 3 months every year. Her excavation from Ahmadi Hospital at the age of 96, at the beginning of the Iraq occupation, is indeed a topic in its own right for another day. I will leave Dame Violet today because such history demands its own speech. Dame Violet was awarded a member of the Order of the British Empire in 1942, the Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1964, and the Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1976. Dame Freya Stark was awarded the Royal Asiatic Society's Sir Richard Barton Memorial Medal in 1934, the Royal Geographical Society the Founders Medal in 1942, and made Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1972. Freya was a prolific letter writer, whether on donkeys, horses, which she loved and rode until her 84th birthday, or camels, which she hated. Such letters formed the basis of over 24 books, including her bestsellers, The Valleys of the Assassins and Other Persian Tales, The Southern Gates of Arabia, A Journey into the Hadramaut. Baghdad Sketches, Journeys Through Iraq, A Winter in Arabia, A Journey Through Yemen, and East is West. Freya brought the past into the present, Meticulous planning, additional training in developing skills for survival, managing a small budget, and erratic travel schedules would not have been enough to secure Freya safe passage through Arabia. As a single woman, she had not been respected. She was, even at an early age, an ethnologist who abhorred fascism, an advocate for the importance of personal contacts and politeness to all. Indeed, she invites us, her readers, through her unique, intimate, and informative style of writing, to be her close companions on her journeys, to experience what she experienced. In time of peril, whether in the face of danger while searching for bronze artifacts of the early Iron Age in Luristan, a prisoner in the British Embassy in the Anglo-Iraqi War, or undergoing Axis bombing of Aden and Cairo in the World War II, she confides to her reader in a way that she would not divulge to her colleagues, that she is frightened. As we realize her fear in her dark times, we share in her excitement, humor, and joy at discovering an unknown castle of Hassan of Sabah, Marco Polo's The Old Man of the Mountains, the enemy of the Crusaders, in Alamut, an unmapped mountain range, a house to rent for $1 in Baghdad, on the Old Quarter, overlooking the Tigris, the delight of finding pearls in the souk, the markets of pre-oil Kuwait, and the desert, which held an extraordinary fascination for her. We learn about the lives of dignitaries, villagers, guides, shopkeepers, doctors, school teachers, and brigands to whom Freya gave her time. Her letters would form the basis of her 4 autobiographies: Traveler's Prelude, Beyond Euphrates, Coast of Incense, and Dust in the Lion's Paw. Born in Paris in 1893 to Bohemian parents and cousins, travel was the norm and considered to be a vital part of childhood social development. Moving between her estranged parents' homes in England and Italy enabled Freya to become bicultural and multilingual. At the age of 13, Freya experienced a traumatic experience. She went into her mother's new carpet factory in Dronio, and a vacuum created by a new machine sucked her hair into a fan. She was saved by her mother's partner pulling sharply on her legs. She lost part of her scalp and an ear. Months of recovery, assisted by her constant companion, 1,001 Nights, increased her determination to excel at challenges she set herself, including mountaineering. When her education at Bedford Ladies' College in London was suspended by World War I, a year before completing her degree in history, Freya was forced to return to Italy and take up nursing. Her first autobiography, Traveler's Prelude, details this work. She would work for the Red Cross, and she would work for the Italian front. In 1917, she became a censor in London. Why did Freya choose the Middle East as a place of travel 10 years later? On the 25th of April, 1920, the San Remo Conference of the League of Nations announced its decision to change the map of the Ottoman Empire of the Near East and to create a new map, a new Middle East. Freya, living close to San Remo, a place where she took Arabic lessons with a monk, would have followed the conference closely. In an interview with Betty Tatchen Green of Saudi Aramco World, she states, Arabic covers the greatest number of countries with the most interesting histories within any reach. And I thought that the countries where oil was being found were going to be the most interesting. On the 11th of December, 1927, a year after Gertrude Bell's death, Freya arrived on the SS Diana in Beirut with £300, her medicine chest, and the belief in Professor Kerr, that to learn a language, you must live amongst his people. She initially stayed at the Quakers' mission in Bromana, run by the Christian Audi family. Freya's letters during that maiden voyage are the foundation of her book, Letters from Syria, a wealth of information about the early years of the new Middle East. Writing to her friend Margaret about Beirut, Freya says, "People are more than scenery, art, or fashion. There is too much civilization here. One great thing about civilization is that it gives you a fresh look of your own." France had been awarded the Mandate of Syria, which included the Jebel Druze. The Druze were a minority, a strong-minded people with a fierce reputation, and who considered themselves to be independent. Freya saw evidence of the 1925-27 Druze rebellion against the introduction of administration methods, rules, and subsequent arrests of Druze leaders. That regardless of it being strictly forbidden to British tourists on the charge of spying for the rebels, due to the British history of support for the Druze, following in Gertrude's footsteps, Freya planned to visit them with a Druze guide and her friend, Venetia Bedicum, who'd come from India. And she quietly crossed the Damascus-Palestine border and traveled by donkey to attend a Druze wedding and talk to the elders for 2 days. On their return, the young women were arrested by the border control and confined to barracks. They blamed their appearance in the Druze territory as a mistake due to an out-of-date Thomas Cook guidebook. And after sharing a cup of tea, were let go. Freya's account of her visit with the Druze became her first paid publication in the Cornwall magazine and secured her an editor and publisher for her future canon, John Murray. Neither did she adhere to British edicts, advised not to visit Luristan in Persia. Freya escaped over the Iraq-Persian border with a single guide to look for non-existent buried treasure, not only concerned about the number of murders of home travellers. The British were undergoing Anglo-Persian treaty talks with the new military ruler, Reza Shah Pahlavi, and did not want an international incident if she was murdered. British officials considered Freya to be a loose cannon, as Sir Kinahan Cornwallis recalled in his foreword to Freya's book, A Winter in Arabia. "For several years, I have encountered Miss Stark when I was in the military and when I was in the Ministry of Interior in Iraq. Miss Stark made light of bureaucrat, red tape, and she saved our hair from going prematurely white by just going and telling us about it afterwards. Only once did Freya document a decision not to go rogue. In her preparation for the Wakefield expedition of Neolithic sites in southern Yemen with archaeologist Gertrude Thompson in 1937, she met Doreen and Howard Ingrams. Howard was the resident of Hadramaut. She wrote, "I am not of those who blame officials for looking upon me with misgivings. In this case, we were bound by ties of kindness, and far as possible, with the officials of Aden. The mutual sharing of information and additional recognition of severe problems that could be caused by Freya to the Ingram's peace, a new agreement signed by 1,400 warring tribes to stop internecine warfare in the Hadramaut, would have deterred Freya from her usual course of action. Unlike Gertrude's caravan, she travelled light, sharing cars, buses, and beds. And as an ex-army nurse, Freya not only relied upon, but was highly appreciative of the traditional methods of the local people and their doctors, which was specific to the location. She writes of an illness suffered by travelling towards the mountains of Alamut, which she scaled barefoot to find the castles of Al-Sabah. I was under the jurisdiction of local women who gave me a bowl of soup, harira, rice, almonds, and milk. They scrubbed one out. She was told by a doctor, with whom she argued about doses of quinine to administer her dysentery, "We know more than your doctors about our illnesses." In turn, she offered her assistance, if requested, to a villager or a tribesman who had walked miles to find her, even suggesting treatment to an armed bandit. One of them had a wounded leg, which I covered with brandy. Only once did an illness make her angry. She recounts it in the southern gates of Arabia, at the fortress of Masna. Freya visited the Sheikh's harem, in which all the children had measles. She remarked, "I had a delirious week." 2 days later, Freya, eager to be the first recorded European to visit the hidden city of Shabwa, decided that she'd recovered and resumed her journey, only to fall seriously ill on the outskirts of the city and require an airlift in Aden by the RAF, to whom she dedicated her book. It was paid for and arranged by her close friend, entrepreneur Sir Anton Bess, founder of St. Anthony's, Oxford. Whilst in hospital, Freya heard that a German photographer, Hans Helfritz, had won the prize for being the first European to reach the outskirts of Shabwa, and she wasn't happy. A few years later, Harry St. John Philby made it to Shabwa with the assistance and protection of King Saud. He acknowledged Freya's efforts in his 1939 book, Sheba's Daughters, a record of travel in southern Arabia. Freya found that if she wanted to visit Baghdad, she had to have a visa. She was told this by her visit in London to the Prime Minister, who was now the ambassador, Jafar Pasha Askari. And she discovered that he didn't send her one. It wasn't until 1929, on her way to Iran to improve her Persian, her Farsi, that she arrived in Baghdad. I had arrived in the city of the Caliph and 1,001 Nights, red squares with a blue line, the Tigris between them. There is a modern high street and a running water with engineers and teachers. But through the secrets of the 1,001 Nights, I see the streets with hanging, painting, balconies. Not wanting to stay in a British compound, she returned to a tiny house in the old quarter, rented from a shoemaker. One window overlooked the boats sailing the Tigris, and women talked to each other from their houses. If any people visited her, people would cross the roof to tell her, knock on her window to tell her that they were coming. To develop her Arabic, Freya enrolled in the Iraqi government school. The love of word, a new sound, thrilled them in the country, where language was part of the soul of the culture. I studied Arabic grammar in a class of 12-year-olds who were very sympathetic. Invited to dinner one evening by a sheikh whose son was studying in the Beirut University and didn't want to return to the ways of his childhood, Freya documents that he stated, "The old laws can rule because the old ways exist. But for how long?" In 1929, Iraq had been put forward by Britain for admission into the independent nation allowance of the League of Nations. When Freya arrived in Baghdad, she stated, "The Iraq Gertrude Bell had helped to build had almost passed away. The country was still divided, but the reins were held by King Faisal with a genius of diplomacy and a small competent band of British advisors and officials who were building up to independence. The confirmation that Bell was insisting on training educated Baghdadi men was given by Freya, who wanted to continue this. One such gentleman, Nasser, who hated English clothes and refused to wear socks, offered to share conversation in Arabic for English tuition. It was fashionable to be anti-British, she said. It made you successful as a lawyer, politician, or journalist. You made an income and were a patriot as well. Later, she wrote, and what is more, we, the British, actively try to produce lawyers, politicians, and journalists. In 1931, Freya was invited to become a journalist for the Baghdad Times and providing information that would prove that the pen is mightier than the sword, created a satirical column called Baghdad Sketches, aimed to be read by the inhabitants of Little England. Freya's determination to champion the side of the local people is evident. In 1937, she published the book Baghdad Sketches, detailing her many journeys from her base in Baghdad. She visited Kuwait between 1933 and 37, Phylacca and the Hellenic temples, Samarra and Tikrit. And she also wrote about the slavery club and the devil worshippers, which are included in chapters. But most importantly, she included chapters entitled European and American Ladies in Iraq, Regulations Requiring Residency and Traveling. The social status of ladies, a problem for the authorities, signed an inquirer, and concerning manners, drawing attention to the developing divide between the Westerners and the people of Iraq. The increasing Baghdadi nationalism was documented in the chapter The Making of a Nationalist. In 1932, Freya was invited to work as a war correspondent for the Times, while still writing for Baghdad Times. She succeeded in being noticed. Major Young tells us that any editor would not be allowed to publish what my editor had. And everyone instantly said he would have done it, because Miss Stark was in the office. King Faisal's sadness about not being able to have sovereignty was gradually increasing to a belief of independence. But his life was cut short. His sudden death of a heart attack at the age of 48, a year later, in 1932, left Iraq open to external influences. The Anglo-Iraq relationship was deteriorating rapidly due to the rise in pro-German support and the rumor of a potential British partition of the Mandate of Palestine. It is through her political information that readers are presented with an in-depth record of the Middle East. Certainly before World War II. In the years leading up to World War II, the mood of her books changed. In a similar way to Bell referencing German expansion, Freya references the build-up of the Italian influence in North African countries in interwar years. When Italy chose to align itself with the Axis powers in World War II, Freya chose to support Britain rather than Italy, and her choice was not taken lightly. It would condemn her mother to prison in Mussolini's Italy. Was Freya a spy? Adrian Sullivan, in his book The Baghdad Set, suggests that Freya had been spying professionally for the British government since the inception of Section D of the Special Intelligence Services in 1938. He admits that there were very few documents existing beforehand to confirm that she did so before. Freya acknowledges her work for British intelligence in World War II in her autobiography Dust in the Lion's Paw. My task was propaganda in South Arabia, Egypt, Iraq, America, India, and Italy. We are all propagandists, with persuasion being our aim. Integrity alone keeps us truthful. In her drive to instill propaganda, Freya was appointed a scriptwriter for BBC Arabic with diplomat and archaeologist Stuart Perrone, her future husband, as chief of programs. However, Axis propaganda was more popular, and the Allies' reputation was diminishing. Freya's idea for a more effective method of propaganda based on the Suk whisper was to recruit a team of local people, fighters for freedom against fascism, the Ikhwan al-Hurriya, Brotherhood of Freedom. In her obituary in the Independent newspaper on the 11th of May 1993, Malise Rudwan states, "It was her faith in mankind that made her an effective propagandist." When she started the Brotherhood of Freedom in Cairo, a network of Allied sympathizers focused on achieving a democracy. In Egypt, it grew from 16 to 75,000. She was openly critical of what she considered lack of British support. In her autobiography, she prints a letter to Cornwallis written in 1940, based on Britain's lack of acknowledgement of information sent by informers. "Our intelligence is filled with sorrow. It appears that there are files and files about it," the Italian builder, reposing at the Colonial Office, if one cares to look at them. "I plan to go up to Yemen, and after the atmosphere, I will alter it from a position of female insignificance, which has its compensation." Freya accepted the invitation from the King of Yemen, His Majesty the Imam Yahya Hamid or Muhammad Hamid al-Din, who had liberated the region from the Ottoman Empire in October 1918. But had no quarrel with Christians or the colony of Britain in South Yemen, as long as there was no interference or intrusion of modernization in his country. Freya was informed by her cook, guide, cousin, who accompanied her on many trips, that all things in Arabia are done in the harem. Get them to wish what you wish, and you will get it. Freya's gender was a great advantage, as she was able to enter the harems, host ladies' tea parties, and talk with them. Refusing to be subversive, Freya insisted on following protocol by requesting from the Queen the permission to present a film show. The royal permits, ruskers, for each performance were awarded. 3 16mm films from the British Ministry of Information, the MOI, had been hidden in her travel commode. 1 for the Army, 1 for the Navy, and 1 for the Air Force. And 2 additional films, Sheep Farming in Yorkshire and Life in Edinburgh, were also available to be shown. Visually innocent, Freya's showmanship and skill in storytelling, with her accompanying sound effects of aeroplanes and bombs, delivered a clear message of British strength and success in a time of increasing Axis occupation in Europe. As news travelled through the harems, inclusive of the royal harem, others requested viewings. Being female-only events, male family members were denied access, which naturally resulted in the request for male-only viewings. Among those who requested viewings were police chiefs, princes, regional emirs, and officials. Knowing the hierarchy was important in Arabia, Freya compared the royal personage of King George VI with Hitler, a wallpaper hanger, and Mussolini, the son of a blacksmith. Regardless the intense pressure that was exerted on Yemen by Italian military, it would remain neutral throughout the war. Freya's fear of fascism was well-founded. In 1941, in Baghdad, 4 pro-fascist generals, the Golden Square, seized control of the Iraqi army, arrested pro-British Iraqi people, deposed the regent king, King Ali, who escaped by the assistance of the American ambassador through Kuwait, and held prisoner the young King Faisal II and the Queen Mother. The square supported pro-German Iraqi Prime Minister Rashid al-Gilani. Doubt of a British victory had hindered the rise of support for Britain and influenced the rise of German support in young Effendis who spread the news in a call to arms. The British embassy, inside which Freya was situated, with the ambassador Cornwallis, came under threat of siege. She just arrived before the doors were closed and documents were banned. During that time, Freya sent out for face powder, which was daily delivered, much to the surprise of those about to siege. Britain retaliated by employing the Royal Navy and Air Force, and the war was put down. Freya was present at the surrender of the new Iraqi government to Ambassador Cornwallis, who she considered acted wisely in his decision to placate angry British residents and pro-British Iraqis, previously in great danger. Freya's accounts are written in East is West and Dust in the Lion's Paw. Freya's final sphere of influence put her into modern Arab-centric definition of the Arabist. The King of Saudi Arabia had raised a concern to the retired political agent of Kuwait, Lieutenant Colonel Violet Dickson, in his representation of the voice of the Arabic people concerning Palestine. As a result, in 1939, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Malcolm MacDonald, has subsequently created a white paper promising the limitation of immigration into the region. Freya realized that it would not come to fruition during the wartime. She wrote, knowing the position of Britain in Arabia, the attention was shifted in impetus to USA. They could not go against their ally. In 1943, on an army ship and suffering from appendicitis, Freya was invited to USA to put forward the case of Arab Palestinian people. Her lecture series resulted in her being labeled pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist in the American press and the Congress. After the war, Freya returned to Italy to rebuild her bombed Italian villa and endured a short marriage to Stuart Perron, separating in 1952. She was determined to continue her travels and writing, and at the age of 86, the BBC filmed Freya sailing down the Euphrates on a raft. And at 88, Freya journeyed to Nepal, participating in a documentary by Colin Lake. She died on the 9th of May, 1993 at the age of 100, having worked tirelessly in the years between 1927 to 45 to build a decaying Anglo-Arab relationship in peace and war times on all fronts. Her authorship and lectures aim to cross the cultural divide between Anglo and Arab, and they are as important to read then as they are today in our divided world, to understand how we can bridge the cultural gap. Sir Kinahan Cornwallis' words encompass the essence of Dame Freya Stark. The value of personal contacts and friendships have been proved over and over again, and the evil of aloofness and indifference are for all to see. But it is hoped that all who read Miss Stark's pages will learn the difference between the right way and the wrong. It is a great pleasure to speak to you tonight, and I have merely touched the surface of the lives of such ladies. Only 3 of the exceptional women of all nationalities across the world who have crossed the cultural bridge. I'm indebted to everybody who has helped me, the organizations, the individuals, and to you. Thank you for listening.
Alison, thank you very much indeed. What a wonderful, compelling insight into 3 remarkable women. And you've really, I think, given us extraordinary food for thought, of course, because in your words, networks of information and activism, but also, of course, reliant on contacts, relations, and friendships, as your final words explored. So it's been an absolute treat. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time and energy to provide us with this talk, and we're extremely grateful. I think I will wrap proceedings up now, given that the sun has set here, but I just want again to say thank you so much for what has been a brilliant survey of 3 remarkable women. And of course, your talk has been recorded, so there will be plenty of opportunities for either our current audience and future audience to explore it again. So with grateful thanks, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure.